Okay, so thank you again for joining me today. My name is Meghan Hayes, and I'm an Ayurvedic health counselor and clinical specialist. I work with my clients on their health challenges and diagnosed diseases through diet, lifestyle, daily habits, and herbal formulations. I'm also currently in an internship to become an Ayurvedic doctor through the California College of Ayurveda. I live in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I help people in person and also virtually. I'm also a Reiki master and an Ayurvedic Marma therapist. So I include these as part of treatment plans when I see clients locally. And today I'm going to talk about what exactly Ayurveda is and how it might help you. So feel free to comment or ask questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to answer at the end of the talk. We should have plenty of time for Q&A as promised. So let's start with the meaning of the word Ayurveda. Ayus, that first part, means life. Vedas, that second part, means science or knowledge. So Ayurveda is the science or knowledge of how to live. It's life science. Ayurveda is the oldest known form of medicine on the planet, and it originated in the Indus River Valley, so the area we now know as India, possibly up to and maybe even over 5,000 years ago. Ayurveda developed alongside the philosophy of yoga, with which you might be familiar, so it's often called the sister science of yoga. And it's often said when one is using yoga to heal themselves, they're practicing Ayurveda. And when someone is using Ayurveda to achieve spiritual enlightenment, they're practicing yoga. So these two studies go hand in hand. It's really hard to talk about one without even mentioning the other. Ayurveda teaches us that disease is the natural end result from living out of harmony with nature and its rhythms, that our symptoms are the natural message of the body to inform us of this imbalance. Healing, on the other hand, is the reverse. So when we learn to live in harmony with our environment and the rhythms of nature and the seasons, we maximize our potential to heal. We put our bodies and our minds in the most optimal state for healing. We are, as humans, designed to heal. And Ayurveda maximizes that potential in the practitioner of Ayurveda. And it's important to kind of start off the structure of Ayurveda by talking about the 5 great elements. And I'm going to name them from gross to subtle, or from the most detectable in the world, that's the gross, to the least detectable, that's the subtle. Okay, so we've got earth, water, fire, air, and ether. And you can think of these elements as metaphors for everything in our world. They're not really literal, right? They represent all the contents of our world. Earth is the idea of structure or stability. So it's everything in the world that has form or is tangible that you can touch and feel. In our bodies, the earth element represents all of our tissues, from our nervous system tissues, our nerves, to our bones, and everything in between, skin, muscle, hair. In our minds, the earth element represents stability. And it's worth noting here that Ayurveda teaches us that whatever's present in the mind is also present in the body, and vice versa. They're not separate systems, but they have an active influence on one another and truly converge to facilitate our healing. And then our next element, water, it's the idea or the metaphor for flow and moisture. So it represents all the fluids in our body. Some examples are lymphatic fluid, sweat, tears, interstitial fluids. And then in the mind, it represents flow. So the ease with which our thoughts flow or don't, and the ease with which we do or again don't flow from one task to another in our daily lives. Okay, that flow. And then the third element, fire. It's the idea or metaphor of or for heat and metabolism or transformation. So it represents the metabolism in every cell of your body, as well as that fire of our digestive system, which transforms food into bodily tissues and waste and byproducts. In our minds, fire represents the transformation of sensory input to clear thoughts, impressions, and concepts. So it represents clarity of the mind. And then the fourth element, air, it's the idea of movement and change. And that's important. Air equals movement. So just like the wind, air can move all of the other elements. Air, this is important to remember, air can influence all of the other elements. So for instance, air can weather or erode the earth. It can cause waves in the water, and it can stoke or blow out a fire. In our bodies, air represents all movement, everything from the movement of food through our digestive systems, the movement of breath in and out of our lungs, to the movement of our limbs. And in our minds, air represents the movement of our thoughts. And then finally, that fifth element, ether. It's a little tricky to understand. It's best thought of as space or a container for all of the other elements. Think of the vast emptiness of outer space, and you'll start to understand the difficult to describe nature of ether, because it is, in fact, ethereal. And the best way, I think, to understand ether is to describe what it does when it accumulates or when it gathers in excess. It begins to diminish the other elements. And ether accumulates very gradually as we age, hopefully gradually, unless we have an imbalance. And so think of what begins to happen in that aging process, especially in the later stages of our life. Our bones become thinner, our hair becomes thinner, our skin becomes thinner, and sometimes our minds become more unstable. So while ether in the body and mind is any space or emptiness or void, when it's out of balance, it tends to deplete and destabilize. So I hope that helps you understand ether and all of the 5 elements. And everyone has all 5 elements in different combinations in their minds and their bodies. For instance, some have very thick bones. That would be an abundance of the earth element, while others have very light, thin, or delicate bones. Some have a great deal of innate moisture in their bodies. They might have very dewy skin and even really profuse sweat patterns, while others have naturally drier skin. Right? You know that person who can exercise for hours on end and barely break a drop of sweat. So they don't have a lot of that water element in their body. It's worth noting that the elements are made of 10 pairs of opposite qualities. So for example, heavy versus light, hot versus cold, dry versus moist. And this is helpful in identifying symptoms. Okay, so we use these qualities to identify the kind of symptoms you're having and the nature of the disease or the health challenge. And then we can apply opposite qualities to heal. So for example, if someone is very dry, in that example I just used, we apply moisture like oils or herbs that have that moist quality, that water element in them. And one that comes to mind is slippery elm. Slippery elm has the ability to draw a lot of water and moisture to the tissues of the body. Even when you put it in water, it becomes very slippery. So it's worth noting the qualities of each of these elements as well. Earth is cold, it's dry, it's heavy, and it's stable. Water is cold, moist, obviously, heavy, and smooth. And there are 10 pairs of opposite qualities. So there are 10 qualities for each element, but I'm just kind of giving you the major ones, the ones that are predominant. Fire is hot, that's obvious, dry, light, and mobile, or more accurately, unstable. Air is cold, dry, light, and mobile. Remember, air is all about movement. And then ether is also cold, dry, light, and unstable. Remember how I said when it accumulates, it destabilizes things or diminishes or depletes the other elements. So these 5 elements that form our world and ourselves come together to form what Ayurveda calls doshas. And you may have heard of this term, and you may have even taken some dosha quizzes. The doshas are the fundamental energies in the universe and in our bodies and minds. And earth and water come together to form Kapha dosha, spelled K-A-P-H-A. Looks like kapha, but it's pronounced kapha. So kapha is cold, moist, heavy, and stable. Because remember, earth and water are both cold. Water takes over, and instead of being dry like earth, it creates moisture. They're both heavy and they're both stable. And then fire and a little water, because you have to have a little water to contain the fire, or else it will take over and turn into a conflagration. They come together to form Pitta dosha. So Pitta is hot like fire, moist like that little bit of water, light and mobile. Because fire is light and mobile, or actually a little bit unstable. And then that air and ether element come together to form Vata dosha. So Vata is cold, dry, light, and unstable, just like air and ether. It's also mobile, just like air. Remember, air and movement, important there. So we've got Kapha dosha, formed from earth and water, Pitta dosha, formed from mostly fire, a little bit of water, and Vata dosha, formed from air and ether. And we'll talk more about each dosha in just a moment. So each person has a unique balance of the doshas with which they were born. And this never changes. This is called your prakruti. Prakruti. And it means before creation. Pra is like pre. Kruti is creation. So before creation, this is the unique combinations of the doshas, and therefore the elements, with which you were conceived. And you might also hear this referred to as your original constitution or your Ayurvedic constitution. Your constitution determines your physical structure, your psychological tendencies, and what you're naturally attracted to or repelled from. You can think of it as your prakruti, as the elements and doshas expressions through your DNA. So how you were conceived. Your prakruti, or your constitution, helps you understand what can keep you in balance and healthy, and what can cause you to become out of balance or sick. So if you understand your prakruti, what your doshas are, then you can empower yourself to choose and create a lifestyle that supports you the best and keeps you from living a life of disease or disharmony. It keeps you from getting sick. It's important to know what dosha means. It literally means stain or flaw, which is interesting, right? Because it's what we're made up of. So, and I like to point this out because it's important to know what our doshas are and whether or not they're in or out of balance. But it's important that we try not to identify with them, right? Or kind of like use them as an excuse in a way. It's really important that we try to balance them, right? So we want to balance these doshas because when left to their own devices, they will express themselves fully That's their job. That's their nature. And so it's our job to rein them in and to balance them. So on that note, you may have also heard of something called a Vikruti. Okay, I just talked about prakruti. So that sort of before creation or at conception state. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about Vikruti. It means after creation or post-creation. So your Vikruti is the term we use when we talk about what's out of balance, which doshas are out of balance in a person, which doshas are causing the disease or those problematic symptoms that you come to an Ayurvedic health counselor for. Your Vikruti could be the same as your prakruti. So what's out of balance could be what's predominant in your constitution. For instance, if you were born with a lot of Pitta Dosha, made of fire and a little bit of water, if you remember, then your Vikruti at any one time might also be Pitta. You might have too much fire. Or maybe you're just always working to keep that fire in balance because you have so much of it. No matter what your constitution or your prakruti, how you were conceived, any of your doshas could go out of balance. So your Vikruti, in fact, could change from day to day. And for many, it changes from season to season, depending on what's going on in your environment and how well you are balancing your doshas in that environment. And so that's why it's important to consult with an Ayurvedic professional if you're not sure about where to focus your treatments. We can really help you with that. And so now we've talked about prakruti, we've talked about Vikruti. Let's get back into those three doshas, Kapha, Pitta, and Vata, and see what they look like in your mind and your body. Okay, so let's start with Vata. Vata dosha. Just as a reminder, a little recap, it's made of air and ether, right? So it's light, dry, unstable, cold, and mobile. Remember, air equals movement. So I want you to note as I go through Vata, Pitta, and Kapha characteristics that you can have any combination of these characteristics in you. So don't be surprised if I go through these three doshas and you find, wow, I've got some Vata, I've got some Pitta, I've got some Kapha. But also don't be surprised if you mainly identify with one or you strongly identify with two. So Vata dosha, the structure of someone, physical structure of someone who has a lot of Vata in their constitution, their prakruti, is going to be a bit thinner, longer, and more narrow. They might have more, you might find this in their bone structure, their musculature. They might have more delicate or smaller features. So eyes, nose, lips. They tend to be drier in general, right? Because air and ether, no moisture, right? So their skin tends to be dry. Their digestion tends to be drier, which means they tend toward gas and bloating after meals, as well as bouts or a lifelong struggle with constipation, or even alternating constipation with diarrhea or vice versa. So the diarrhea dries them out and then they're constipated. That air element, remember, air equals movement, and it's instability, it's variability, right? Changes like the wind. It tends to create unstable or weak digestion. So that's what's creating those symptoms like gas, bloating, and constipation. Their sleep, someone who has a lot of Vata in their constitution, their sleep tends to be light. They awaken very easily. They sweat also very lightly. So kind of scanty sweat patterns. We talked about that a little earlier in one of the examples of not a lot of water in the body. Their body temperature tends to be on the colder side, especially their hands and feet. Mentally or psychologically, they have a harder time making decisions because they're always coming up with new ideas. That's that air element, that movement of the mind. And they have very creative and expansive thinking. That's that ether element, that space. They can sort of pull things out of the void. Their stress levels tend to create more anxiety and worry in their mind. They tend to have a hard time following through to completion with projects. When they're really out of balance, though, They have trouble committing to a course of action. They have trouble holding on to or retaining information, and they might be sort of spacey or unfocused. But when people with a lot of Vata in their constitution live in harmony with their environment, practice Ayurveda and a Vata reducing lifestyle and diet, these things aren't necessarily a problem. There's something they're always on the lookout for, they're mindful of, and they're working on preventing them, right? So we can be an imbalanced Vata or Pitta or balanced Kapha Vata or whatever your unique combination is, right? So the strengths of those doshas come forth versus their so-called weaknesses or imbalances. And next we have Pitta Dosha. So remember, Pitta is made of mostly fire and a little bit of water. And I want to mention that water is something you can think of less as like actual water and more like oil. Okay, so it has an oily quality. So even think of a flame that needs, some oil to fuel it, like an oil lamp, or even a candle that needs the beeswax, right, to kind of give it a container or a home. So the structure of somebody who has a lot of Pitta in their prakruti or their natural original constitution, they tend to be more moderate, right? That fire burns pretty consistently in their metabolism. Remember, fire is all about transformation of our food into tissue and energy, and transformation of, in our cellular metabolism. So they tend to have more of a moderate structure with a little bit of sharpness. That fire tends to have a sharp quality. So they have a little bit of angularity in their features. They might have a very chiseled cheekbones or quite chiseled musculature. Their eyes might have an intense quality to them versus Vata, which has that air, movement, and expansiveness. Their eyes might be darting all over the place. Pitta is going to have a pretty intense gaze. They tend to be a bit oily, so skin, and also their digestion can tend to be quite intense, like I mentioned, that intense fire element. So they might have some burning after meals or tend toward that when they're out of balance, as well as a tendency toward loose stools, maybe even multiple bowel movements every day. They might go or eliminate shortly after a meal or even each meal. And they may even have pretty intense or burning diarrhea when they're out of balance. So elimination is a way for the body to release heat. So when you have a lot of fire or a lot of heat, you might tend to eliminate more frequently. They tend to have very efficient and pretty quick metabolisms due to that abundance of fire element that I've mentioned many times now. So again, their structure, it's harder for them to put on weight. And if they do, it's pretty easy for them to lose weight. Whereas Vata, on the other hand, they might have trouble gaining weight, or they might fluctuate wildly. And that is that air or that movement or that variable quality of Vata. So Pitta tends to be more of a moderate sleeper. They wake up if they're hot, right? But they return to sleep pretty easily. They tend to be pretty moderate sweaters, but they sweat very easily, right? They're like the first person to start sweating. And that sweat, interestingly, might have a sharp odor to it. Their body temperature, as you can imagine, is very warm. They prefer cooler climates. And their decision-making is pretty easily done. So they're usually in like leadership positions. They gravitate toward those kinds of positions. They're goal-oriented, whereas Vata is more creative. Pitta is a little more driven, and they absorb information very well and form clear concepts out of it. Stress-wise, versus Vata, right? Remember, Vata gets worried and anxious, or they tend to. Pitta gets intense and they tend to work harder, right? They're kind of like the classic workaholic. Their approach to projects is typically in a way that it's very easy to complete projects. They stay on course unless new information is presented that makes sense. When they're out of balance, that fire element tends to create a lot of anger, intensity, criticism, and judgment, right? They have an opinion on everything, even if they have no idea how to do it. They think they know best and have some control issues. But when they live in harmony with their environment and they're practicing Ayurveda, just like I mentioned when we were talking about Vata, and they practice that pitta reducing lifestyle and diet, then these things aren't a problem, right? There's something they're always watching, right? Those doshas, we're trying to keep them reined in. We're trying to keep them balanced. So they might always work on preventing that and know that they have those tendencies. But when we're in balance, these things aren't really a problem. Now let's move to Kapha dosha. So Kapha dosha, our third dosha, if you remember, is made of earth and water. So it's very stable, quite cool, because earth nor water has an innate fire element in it, or a source of heat in it. And it tends to be quite slow and steady and heavy. So for Kapha, or people who have a lot of kapha in their prakruti, or original constitution, or how they were conceived, their structure tends to be on the larger or thicker, or even kind of shorter, compact side, right? With some softness, especially in their eyes. So they have very sort of soft, sweet eyes or energy, whereas pitta is more intense and vata is kind of all over the place. So their skin tends to be very smooth and soft because of that water element and that innate moisture that they might have. Their digestion can tend to be on the slower side, right? So think of water and earth elements coming together. What does water and dirt make? Mud, right? And it's kind of sticky and slow and doesn't really flow. So you can sort of think of when kapha is out of balance, things become sluggish and slow and heavy, especially after meals, especially if they overeat, which isn't hard for them to do. It's not hard for them to overload their digestive system because their metabolism, unlike pitta with all that fire, tends to be on the slower side. Okay. So their sleep, as you can imagine, is pretty deep as well. It's hard to wake them up in the morning. They're heavy, they can be very groggy. They might need like 6 alarms placed strategically in line to the coffee maker. So their sweat is interesting. So they have a lot of moisture innately, so they can sweat very profusely and abundantly. However, it takes a while for them to get there, because their skin is thinner. They tend to have, a denser insulation, if you will, around their body. So it takes a lot of heat and a lot of activity to get there. But when they do start sweating, it's very abundant, right? So their body temperature is more on the cool side. Again, because they're more sort of insulated and have thicker skin, they're not as bothered by temperature fluctuations the way vata and pitta might be, right? The way vata might be when it gets cold, the way pitta might be when it gets warm. Their skin might even be a little bit clammy or moist to the touch, again, because of that innate moisture element or that water element. Their decision-making, so we're getting into the psychological tendencies of somebody with a lot of kapha in their constitution. They can be very slow to make decisions or process new information. But once the information is processed or the decision is made, they will stay the course, right? And they'll sort of retain information indefinitely. So really good at keeping memories, sort of holding on to dates and important things. Their reaction to stress tends to be not really reactive. So they can withstand a lot of stress. They're very steady. When they do get really stressed out, they tend to withdraw. They tend to kind of remove themselves. Like, I'm just going to go take a nap until this is all over. They tend to be very slow at completing projects, but they follow through and they're really good supporters, right? So if Vata is really creative, right? They're the ones who are the outside of the box thinkers. You want them on your creative team. And then Pitta, you want to lead because they see the goal and they accomplish it. And they're good at being clear and focused. And again, they're goal oriented. And then Kapha, you want them to manage everyone because they're very nurturing and supportive and steady. And they don't really succumb to the dramas, right, that might come up when you're trying to get something done in a team. When they're out of balance, they tend to, like I mentioned, they tend to be withdrawn, and they even get very clingy and attached to relationships, to their possessions, to their way of being. So they can be very difficult to motivate to change. They can get stuck in their ways. Again, when they're living harmoniously in their environment, practicing Ayurveda and a kapha reducing lifestyle and diet, then these things aren't a problem. Again, there's something they're always on the lookout for. They're mindful of, they're working on preventing, they're applying those opposite qualities, but they're not an issue unless, right, we're unmindful and those things become out of balance. We're living disharmoniously with our environment. So I hope that gives you an idea of how we might begin to determine what your Ayurvedic constitution or your prakruti is, right? So it's based on physical structure, which tends not to change throughout our lives, our psychological tendencies, which typically stays the same throughout our lives with exception, and our digestive tendencies, lifelong digestive patterns, and some of those other things I mentioned, sweat patterns, sleep patterns, right? So physical patterns, psychological patterns. And so then that's the first step in your Ayurvedic healing journey is figuring out what your prakruti, what your Ayurvedic constitution is. So next, we would look at determining your Vikruti. Remember, that's what's going on right now after creation. It can change from day to day, season to season. It can be different from your prakruti. It can be the same as your prakruti. So it's what's out of balance. That's the kind of jewel that we're really looking for. That's what we want to treat. So there are some Vata symptoms I'm just going to list that could determine what your Vikruti is. And some of those are when Vata is out of balance, we get gas and bloating, constipation, alternating constipation with diarrhea. Remember that variable or movement that's in the element of air, dry skin, hair loss. Remember, ether depletes things, so we lose tissue, weight loss, anxiety, worry, fear, those more Vata-driven emotions, or maybe an ability to gain weight, right, in addition to that weight loss. And those are just a few little things. There are so many different symptoms that are driven by Vata. And in fact, I emphasize Vata because it's usually the culprit behind most imbalances in my experience. So even if you have a Pitta imbalance, chances are there's some air blowing that fire into a conflagration or blowing that fire out, right? In the case of something like burnout. If there's a kapha imbalance and maybe somebody is retaining fluid or putting on weight, it's usually because there was a Vata imbalance first. And that's the body's way of grounding you and trying to stabilize you when you're not taking care of those things yourself. So that's a whole other talk. But I just want to point out that it's really important to look at Vata, how quickly you're moving through life, your changeability, how quickly we move through life really is the important part of that, I think, for most people. We have this inability to sit down, right? To sort of settle, to be focused or quiet. And our society kind of drives that Vata that tends to throw everyone out of balance. So that's why I like to emphasize that air element, that movement. Remember that air equals movement. So Ayurveda says the faster we move, the faster we age. Yikes. Faster we move, the faster we age. So it's always important to look at Vata because our society, right, sort of encourages us to move more quickly and do more and do it all at once. And technology too, right, is so fast. Our world has become very fast. So Vata tends to be the driving force behind most imbalances. So I just want to leave you with that thought that Vata is typically the ruler of imbalance. So check out your own Vata and how quickly you tend to move through life and why you do, right? Why do you really value that? And why do you? Okay, so moving on. Here are some Pitta symptoms that would show maybe somebody has a Pitta Vikruti or imbalance. Burning digestion. You've heard some of these before. Burning diarrhea or loose stool. Inflamed or red skin, any redness, any heat in the body or the mind. So anger, judgment, criticism. And again, any increased heat in the body. Okay. And then Kapha symptoms. And again, these aren't exhaustive lists, but a few Kapha symptoms, sleepy and heavy after eating, mucus in the stool. That's the water element coming in there. So when we tend to produce excess mucus when there's a Kapha imbalance or a Kapha reaction to something else, swelling or water retention, so again, that water element. And then we talked about this just now, stubbornness or unwilling to change, or extreme attachment to people, places, or things, lack of motivation or dullness, and weight gain. So once we determine what your Vikruti or your imbalance is, and again, more often than not, there's a combination of doshas out of balance. And in my personal experience, most of the time, Vata is the cause behind most imbalances. Then we put together a treatment plan that involves diet, daily practices, and herbal formulations. And Ayurveda teaches us that all disease begins in the digestive system. So that's where a great deal of our focus lies in a treatment plan. Ayurveda seeks to treat the root cause of health challenges. So once we start to see digestive symptoms subside, and I get really excited when they do, your other symptoms begin to resolve as well, which is truly amazing to see. And the Ayurvedic health counseling model seeks to teach you how to get back into balance and heal, whether it's a digestive issue or an autoimmune disease. And I've been trained to teach my clients how to use specific diet recommendations and lifestyle practices to create healthy habits that not only bring about total transformation and healing, but they keep you that way, right? So we're looking for lifelong balance, not a quick fix. We're not just treating symptoms. We're treating the root cause and teaching you how to keep yourself in balance. And so along the way, I design herbal formulations specifically tailored to your Vikruti and your prakruti to facilitate the healing process. And these can be in all kinds of different forms. So everything from capsules to churnas or powders, spice blends, medicated oils, medicated ghees, teas, tinctures, etc. And I want to leave you with just a few things. One is that Ayurveda treats the whole person, the body, the mind, and the soul. So not only will you discover the perfect way of eating for your constitution and any imbalances, but you'll experience body therapies, meditation, breathing exercise, yoga asana, or movement or exercise tailored specifically for you, and so, so much more. Ayurveda is timeless wisdom that will transform how you approach your everyday life. So how you approach your everyday life. And that's where the real healing begins. And it never truly ends because it's a lifetime of practicing, right? It's something you can work on every day for the rest of your life, good or bad. I think that's a good thing, right? You always have an opportunity to grow and to heal every single day. Every morning that you wake up is a new opportunity to heal. So I hope this gives you some insight into this ancient system of medicine and this powerful system of healing, one I absolutely love and cherish. And I hope you'll reach out with questions or to work together in the future. I would love that. I love answering questions and talking about Ayurveda. So again, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you so much for being here today. And I'm going to turn off the recording before I do any Q&A. So to anyone watching the recording, thank you again. And I hope you have a great rest of your day or an evening, wherever you are.